Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of Zuher. This is Chen, a dear friend. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and late medieval China. I'm based in Austin, Texas. And today, with me to explain to you our reaction or tentative reflection upon Hegel's project of science of logic is my dear friend Aran. How are you doing, Aran?
I'm doing good, Trent. Hello, everyone. I am an educator of philosophy based in Austin and happy to be here.
Right. Today's a rather an unusual episode because instead of following suit what we've been doing for the past several episodes, namely taking our listeners through the steps Hegel moved the form of a being in his magnum opus, The Science of Logic, we're actually giving our kind of tentative feedback or of reflection about many important structures or guiding principles in this book, as Houlgate made explicit in his interpretation of Hegel's project. So, would you like to take our lead
Yeah,
listeners to the conclusions or reflection that we have accumulated so far?
yeah. So what is going to happen in this project, as Trent mentioned, is that we have been talking about Hegel's science of logic for a while, and we have used um, Stephen Houlgate's interpretation of uh, the beginning of Hegel's logic as our guide, and we started with talking about Hegel's science of logic as Houlgate understood it. The more we did that, though, we came to some kind of conflict uh, with Houlgate's interpretation. But at some point, this interpretive problem we suspect is something about Hegel and not just Houlgate's interpretation. So what we have done is that we have tried to expose what happens from being, from the very beginning of the book, from being to change, emergence of change in the logical process. And now it is critique time, right? And we think this is gonna make our the whole project of Versuche meaningful in the sense that we're not just it's not a book report, but now we are entering a different stage. And after that, we will again go back to the book and follow through. But you're gonna have you should expect these episodes to pop up here and there. Now we have a structure of how we want to approach this um, critical remarks. Very broadly, we have thought about two categories here, two main questions, but within those questions, we have very much detailed issues at hand. One question, one main category is about immanence and presuppositionlessness in Hegel's science of logic. And broadly speaking, our question is how immanent and presuppositionless is Hegel's science of logic, right? And this is a question that we have grappled with from the very beginning, because these two tenets are very important for Hegel. He doesn't shy away from, expressing this value of science of logic being, kind of contained in immanence and presuppositionless. And we talked about Holgate, we talked about our own issues there at the very beginning of this project. And one of the important distinctions that arise there is a distinction between founding presuppositions and enabling presuppositions, right? And we spend a lot of time kind of like going over this distinction that, of course, you cannot do science of logic if, like you don't have certain intellectual faculties, or you don't use language, or you even like some cultural enabling presuppositions, like maybe if you haven't been to certain episodes, historical episodes, enlightenment, let's say. And this type of questioning doesn't seem even possible or accessible if you're living in a very, I don't know, uh, enchanted world, for instance, right? And these are all enabling conditions, they're enabling presuppositions that Hegel admits. So when we think about presuppositionlessness, we're not thinking about some, just out of nowhere. It's about something else. It's about founding presuppositions. And the point is that what Hegel was telling us is that all of these philosophers of the past relative to Hegel, but also probably applicable to some post-Hegelian philosophers, if not all of them, they have already started with certain founding presuppositions. Some of these founding presuppositions have been, most importantly, about the relationship between being and thought, right? That, being is something, thought is something else. And now you need to like wonder how thought is related to this absolutely other thing we call being, right? And this is just an example, an important example. It's not just that, but it is pivotal in what Hegel is interested in Hegel's science of logic, in the science of logic, because he thinks that this is unjustified. Why? Why should we start from absolutizing cares, right? Why should we start from like this kind of gap between concepts, these contrasts that are not just emerging, but we've already accepted that, yeah, of course, being is something quite severed from thought. Why? And in that sense, Hegel wants to be presuppositionless. He doesn't want to presuppose anything about what thought is, and indirectly, that means he doesn't want to presuppose anything about what being is, right? Now, Hegel still thinks that this absence of founding presuppositions is articulable, right? It is not that, if we don't presuppose anything about being, that means that just everything just, let's just go home, everything vanishes. No, there is a concept that correlates with no founding presupposition about being. That conceptual articulation is to think about being as pure immediacy. And with that conceptualization, we can begin. Because when you think about being as pure immediacy, you have taken away all of those things that, like, according to Hegel, contaminates like Descartes or Kant, right? All of those presuppositions about relations. No. There is no relations. There's just this pure presence of being. There's no, all the distinctions become like artificial, and we can just start there. Now, Hegel thinks that like starting there, we don't know we are starting anywhere in a weird way, right? And we talked about this analogy of a serialized novel that is like published every week in a weekly magazine. You don't know when it ends, right? You don't know if this was the shortest story. That was it. That was the end of it. Like you don't know. You just open the papers and you see that, oh, there's a story there. That's Hegel's science of logic. The fact that it is like 800 pages doesn't mean that it doesn't have a beginning in that sense. It has numerous attempts, right? And those attempts happen because prior attempts fail,
Right.
partially, right? And this whole thing gets related to the point about immanence, which means that Hegel wants to, like Hegel's claim is that when we start with from saying that, oh, being is pure immediacy, we should be open to the possibility of just like saying that, oh, that's it. This is it. We're good. Let's go. We have found what pure being is, right? Unless there is something internally incoherent about thinking of being as pure immediacy. And in that sense, we may need to make amendments, make changes. We might end up realizing that, oh, but pure immediacy doesn't make sense for so and so reason, so that we can go to the next. The idea is that this shouldn't be an external criticism right? Meaning that, you can never meaningfully criticize an atheist by just assuming there's a God, or vice versa. That doesn't make any sense. It only makes sense if one takes the other's position and show why that position fails on its own ground, right? If a religious person goes to an atheist and say that, okay, yeah, let's agree, there is no God, but let me show you why starting from that presupposition means that you believe in a God, for whatever reason, like how that would happens, then something has moved internally. That's immanence, right? Now, because we have talked about all of those stuff about immanence and presuppositionlessness, uh, we're not going to repeat those, right? This is just a summary. We still think, in spite of our original defense, we still think there are very important and interesting problems in place. And we want to talk about those. We have four main ideas here. And we're going to start talking about that. Before moving on, Trent, do you have something to add as just like a broad image of what we're going to do?
Yes, a little bit. Thanks, first of all, for your wonderful summary of what we've done so far. And I think the only thing I want to highlight at this moment is by pointing out our potential conflicts with Houlgate's interpretation, or even with Hegel himself, with regard to how thoroughly immanent and presuppositionalist that his project is, does not result in our dismiss of the whole project. We're still, because we are very much impressed by the whole ambition and radical and intention kind of proposed by Hegel as a thinker. I think this kind of critical remarks would put the whole enterprise in better conversation with other, in Hegel's characterization or understanding, transcendental or quasi-transcendental, or with grounding presuppositions that the philosophers the system. So that it's basically we're trying to do justice not to Hegel, but also find a better intellectual and even cultural context to understand and appreciate his project. So with that in mind, I think we can dive into the particularities, and why don't we start with the beginning? Because as you already said in your summary, linguistic articulation was very much central to the whole movement of like the form of being in Hegel's project. Can you like elaborate and develop that?
Yeah. And just a quick point, because I think what you mentioned is very important, just reminded me of something. It's remember that what we are doing with Hegel or someone else, we take these people, we pick these people because we think they have something important to say, relevant to our time and our thinking and our condition, right? And our engagement with them at the core of it has, we are not trying to, like, if we say something about Hegel, right? And we say, we think that this makes sense, and someone is saying that, okay, but this is not Hegel. We're not trying to become interpreters of Hegel. We're trying to figure things out in like various questions that we have in the central to humanities, and that's the purpose of that engagement. So that engagement not only is not about just rejecting based on we're not in his camp, it's about like that kind of fertile ground, but also it's not about creating an accurate interpretation of Hegel. It's moving something else. It's moving in a different dimension in general. So going to the first point about is related to this point about immanence and presuppositionlessness. And this is a point that I think has been said by others, and some places like Houlgate mentions this about Feuerbach and Schelling, and I have read from Robert Stern talking about this from Gilles Deleuze's perspective. So this is not just we're not coming up with this. I think there are some points there that make might make our approach a little bit different from and these thinkers. Now, the idea is, you know, like let's go back to the beginning, right? And we have being as pure immediacy. Okay. Now, immanence, immanent development, right? As you already know, if you have followed us or you've read the book before, uh, it becomes clear, if you can say so, that being as pure immediacy is not coherent. Being as pure immediacy just turns out to be nothing, right? That's going to be the movement, right? And that movement is supposed to be immanent. And one of the things that me and Trent kept kind of coming back to was that, like, what is this move, right? When this happens, what exactly is happening? And just as a kind of an exaggerated example, if we just think about, okay, someone comes to the project of logic with all, good intentions of trying to figure what being is about, they hear pure immediacy, and their response is to just like start dancing, right? And that's their, going back to the analogy of the serialized novel, that's the next step, right? Like at the end of it's not always coming in words, right? Now, next week, when the next part of the novel is supposed to be written, it's just an address to, the dance club, right? That could be something that could be like the next move. Like, where is that possibility? Which is something that, if you think about a lot of like mystic kind of traditions, like those types of reactions to, realizations, it's not very odd. Like, it's not something that example of GAMS is as a random, sounds like a random example, but it could also be very much related to these experiences. Where is room for that? Like, what would Hegel say to that? Like, what happens if someone says that, yeah, I imminently, from the thought of, being as pure immediacy, I just erupted into dancing, and that's the end of the book for me. That's the book, right? I got the book. The point here is that, maybe the response would be that, no. You need to kind of articulate your position. It's not like when you do that, sure, you can do that, but it doesn't really move anything unless you articulate that. And when that response comes in, then our suspicious taste it becomes dominant, because it seems like that Hegel expects the development of the concept to be fully articulable in language, right? And I don't know where that presupposition come from. One line of thinking here could be that, if you say pure being, right, pure immediacy is being, and then you start dancing, then this is like a dead end, right? Either someone else will start dancing with you, or they think you're mad, or they just go about their business, or whatever. It's just like a dead end, right? Linguistic articulation is necessary because otherwise we don't have anything fertile, right? Another way to put this is that unless we articulate things in language, we do not have any proof for what we claim. And I think it's helpful to kind of make a parallel with make a parallel clear to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, how it starts, because it's very much related to the beginning of logic with sense certainty. And sense certainty is very similar to, this position here, that sense certainty is just like, what is truth? whatever, and they just point at stuff like this, and that, and right, just like pointing at the world. And Hegel's argument there for why that doesn't work is that upon linguistic interrogation, this doesn't mean anything. This is just, this could be this laptop, this could be this room, this could be this country, this could be this planet, it could be anything. And on its own, it's not really determining anything, right? And if someone stubbornly just say that, no, it is determining, I am pointing at it, right? I just cannot articulate it in language, they're just, they're chickening out. They're not really paying attention to what is needed here. Unless you are able to articulate your claim in language, your claim is not, in a very broad sense, verifiable, or there is no way to know whether your claim actually makes sense or not. Right? Now, I have two things here. Maybe. We'll see how it goes. One is about this point, that unless you can articulate your claim in language, your claim is not verifiable. Okay, that's one thing. And the other thing, that given is that's the case, that means that you cannot have a non-linguistic articulation of language, articulation of truth, sorry. And these are, of course, intertwined, but I think the difference could be meaningful, because I can accept this point. I can accept that unless a claim is articulated in language and it is susceptible to critical assessment, right? It's a claim. Sure, you can have many claims, right? But it doesn't raise above a claim. Given that I have accepted that, which is like, accepting that itself is not guaranteed. Like this, that could be a problem with that. Even if I fully accept that, where did I get this idea that truth can be more than a claim in the form of a dance? Like what made me accept that, truth is the kind of a thing that is going to be accessible to language in its full expression, and therefore it is provable, or therefore it could be shown exactly why it is the case. Again, that could be true. That could be true. There could be a way to show that the dance is not really getting at anything, right? But that claim, that point hasn't been proved in Hegel's science of logic at all. It is being presupposed, because I could say that there is no further articulation possible to be in touch with truth. And you could say, but that's only a claim. That's I'm not sure if I'm using the word correctly, but esoteric claim, like just only a couple of people can understand it, like it's just through experience, or there is no proof for it, right? And I could accept that. I could accept that I understand what you're saying. Like, dancing is not articulate enough, it's not susceptible to critical evaluation, still could be truth. Like, just because I cannot articulate in language and just subject it to critical analysis linguistically, it doesn't mean that it's not truth. It's not that I'm not accessing something true. It just means I cannot linguistically articulate it, which is a different problem.
Yes, those are really good points. And as a cultural historian who does comparison, I am really intrigued and actually fascinated by the cultural social conditions that made Hegel's personal assumptions about what is the acceptable form of knowledge at the first place. I think that's really interesting, because you mentioned 2 points. Let me say what, and you can tell me whether I understood it correctly or not. One is only through linguistic articulation can a truth claim be verifiable. And the second one is truth is not just articulated, but also exclusively experienced or felt or really understood through linguistic articulation. And yes, if that's the case, it's really interesting because it seems like if we do a sociology of Hegel's knowledge, that would be knowledge of truth, no, being, or the truth in the broadest, the construed sense, is a matter of, there's a matter of communicability or human communication baked into it. Unless you have that, your understanding of that the truth claim subjected to other individuals or whatever social institutions verification, that is not a sufficient or meaningful knowledge, because that is shareability or transferability of knowledge is kind of intrinsic constituent of like what he considers knowledge to be, which is, first of all, that's a presupposition, as you said. What if, like, with the first invocation of the term, the pure immediacy, I'm like the historical Buddha, I just got enlightened. And I have absolutely no way to share my enlightenment with anybody around me through whatever ways of communication, even dancing. So, but I did feel that, and that is very, in my eyes, culture specific approach towards the concept of knowledge. Because in other traditions, such as like early or ancient the South Asian meditative, like not just mystic but also meditative, the ascetic traditions, like that is precisely done through non-linguistic tools and in reaction to the early Vedic seers or poets claim that the truth about, say, being or the cosmos that is done through linguistic articulation. So you do see debates in that realm. And also in, say, Zen or Chan Buddhist development in East Asia, also they were fighting against the Imperial Chinese claim of truth must be associated with verifiable classical writing. So what I think unites, say, the early Vedic poets or seers and Imperial Chinese officialdom and Hegel to in a very interesting sense is a certain assumption about the centrality of or the power of written words, or not necessarily written words, but definitely a linguistic articulation in one's definition of the concept of knowledge. It's that. And in addition, if we even step back a little bit further, that language is not the only, or linguistic articulation is not the only form of communication. We do see, say, Zen or Chan anecdotes where certain gestural communication. I picked up a petal from a flower, and the master recognized that I got enlightened. And as you are around, by the way, dear listeners, around an experienced dancer, and you don't need to talk with a person to know whether a person is adapted in a specific form of dance. You can communicate very meaningfully by being in that person's presence. And why couldn't that be a good way to verify one's like understanding of being? If being is just pure immediacy, and then somebody embodies, sort of feels that immediacy better than somebody else, and it's also done through like social communication exchange among individuals, and it's not even that different with the assumption that communicability is an intrinsic part of knowledge, as Hegel understood. But even we agree on that, Hegel, it seems so that monopoly given to linguistic articulation of truth is kind of presupposition, and it's definitely culture specific in my eyes. Yes, that's my
Yes, I think that those are great parallels, and yeah, I think like I have two things, and we can then move on to the second point. It's like number one, because you mentioned like those kind of like meditative traditions, and like also like koans in like Zen Buddhist tradition, right? I think that kind of a reaction, like I don't know if Hegel knew anything about koans, right? I don't know if he knew anything about and knew anything meaningful about like Buddhist traditions. But I wonder, like, what would be his response of
Right.
someone just asking about enlightenment or asking about truth, and someone like cutting their finger and then become enlightened in the sight of that. Like, how would that story be perceived by Hegel, because it seems like that reaction is already excluded. And we might be able to say that as much as Hegel dogmatically exclude the, that type of a reaction as a proper reaction, proper enlightening reaction, the Buddhist tradition does the same to its opposite. I don't know about that. Like, I'm not saying that Hegel is like alone in his dogmatism, but I'm saying that this is not this exclusion is never justified. I'm not like, if I am someone, and by the way, I think there might be something about me and you, because we have come from a different tradition and we are now here, and I think this kind of like back and forth is meaningful with me and for me and Trent, is that this is not this exclusion is not, you're not logically convinced, you might be culturally convinced, right, as a matter of a long-standing tradition that we are part of, or Hegel was part of. But that's not insignificant. That's not a presupposition that you say, yeah, whatever. Like, his presupposition that he is in like post-enlightenment, but that changes the whole conception of truth. Then, that's just, where did we get the warranty that the warrant that the post-enlightenment exposition of truth in the linguistic form is the truth? Like that, where did that justification come from? Number two that I want to say is that none of the points that I have made, and I think none of the points that Shen has made, means that just okay, there is no it's whatever, right? It is not just like this kind of like giving up. One might say, for instance, that if as a cultural presupposition we assume the validity of this kind of random dance like enlightenments, then as a culture, like, the potential for charlatanism is just going to arise. I'm talking about just like social consequences of living in a cultural space that might be very conducive to that idea. Maybe we become lazy in thinking, and being lazy in thinking and inability in articulation in language has also some other consequences. I appreciate that. I think there is value in this kind of a robust ability to linguistic articulation. That doesn't mean that it encompasses truth, or that doesn't mean that this process is the only process possible. It just means that, okay, given that we're interested in this valuable thing, let's proceed this way.
Right.
It's not the same as saying that this is absolutely immanent, because it doesn't seem like that it is. Anything to add to that?
Very- May I have a very quick response, and you can carry to the second point? I think this is a question we should further develop in the Versuche project. Is we should examine Hegel as a human scientist, what his understanding of like human nature, what makes us like human beings. I wonder to what extent, if he has like a list of parameters, and where would he put the ability to use language to talk about the abstract concept? Is that like the most important thing for human reason and self-consciousness? And if so, like how, or he's more a so-called, I don't know, in layman's term, cultural relativism, like this is an intrinsic part of the tradition where his idea took root, or is universal to, he can use this as a meaningful way to evaluate other, say, cultural traditions, truth claim, because it's a universal difference. And so back to the same thing, we don't have to
Yeah,
dwell on
but
this.
to that, I want to even press this further and say that, like, there's Hamann in Hegel's tradition, that would definitely not, like, even this assumption about the the unification of that, this is about that the project of the European Geist, right? And this is just the exposition of that. That
Right.
also is, to me, as incomplete as the cultural comparison with Buddhists of Burma, because it is like, yeah, you pick one line of the European, you know, process of civilization,
Right.
and then say that's the one.
Hmm.
Like, there are all sorts of Christian mystics that are not big fans of linguistic articulation of truth. Like, I don't think Hegel can get a warrant for what he's doing, even by saying that, oh, this is the post-enlightenment world. But that is no argument
Right.
for any sort of even saying that this is we're dealing with the European, guys. That's also suppression of diversity within the tradition. So I think that it still becomes a problem, even if this is not about cultural, like in the sense of, okay, Europe of 19th century and like Burma of like 5th century, right? But it could be much more localized, and suffocating in that way. So I think this is going to be a theme that we're going to definitely come back to, and we're fascinated by this theme. I think it's just like beyond Hegel. It's going to be important. What Trent mentioned about human nature is also very important, because we are very suspicious, I could say, about Hegel's conception of human nature, in the sense that whether he really understands that kind of inherent diversity in it, and like how he could, you know, wage his position against someone like Nietzsche, even, that is very much about this kind of inherent diversity of humanity.
Right.
But I think it's good for us to move to the second point now. And the second point is different for two reasons. Number one is more specific. It's not just about the whole project. Number two, I think our problem is with Houlgate, and our problem is not with Hegel in the second problem. So we have being, we have nothing, right? That is the first move, if you wish, that happens in the book, right? What is this move? Because it's like one of those things that is probably one of the most enigmatic moves. Because pure immediacy, being a pure immediacy, okay, if we proceed, we need to proceed imminently.
Right.
It tells me that there has to be something not coherent in like being as pure immediacy that makes it like next move will be justified. That, oh, okay, that just means it is not, right? And we're going to talk about this kind of like criterion problem uh, shortly. But here we have a very specific type of problem, because Houlgate says that, okay, being is pure immediacy, but hey, pure immediacy, the pure immediacy, being and being and being, but that's just nothing, right? And then we go to nothing. And explicitly, because we had this kind of a confusion about what is at stake here, we consulted his lectures on uh, science of logic that Trent has put in the description of one of our last uh, episodes. And he explicitly says what he doesn't think that is happening there. And I think what he says is not happening there is exactly what is happening here. So let's see how this goes.
Right.
So,
Okay. Great.
and this is also for people who are familiar with the scholarship, Hegel scholarship. This is like a Pippin Houlgate problem, Robert Pippin, Stephen Houlgate problem. So Pippin says that being like pure immediacy, being as pure immediacy, the reason it moves, and I'm modifying Pippin's position, but it's like along the same lines. The reason being as pure immediacy even just ends up being nothing is that being as pure immediacy has some sort of a claim. And that claim is the claim that I am determinate. As pure immediacy, I am determinate. And because it is not determinate, for reasons that I'm going to say in a second, then it's nothing but indeterminacy. And indeterminacy is just a name for nothing, right? But then we have this kind of, this is not exactly what Pippin says, but this is how I understand it, that now we have nothing as indeterminacy, but that is itself some sort of determination. It is that. Now we're kind of going back that, okay, what is it to be indeterminate? We're back to is, we're back to being. And for being, all we have is pure immediacy. We're back to being, but being pure immediacy cannot be determinate. It is indeterminate, and so on and so forth. It's just going to be this kind of back and forth, and then we go to the next phase. Now, 2 points. Number one, the point about the pure immediacy not being determinate is very much related to everything that we said about linguistic articulation, because Hegel has a very specific understanding of that determination, I think. And that means that it cannot prove itself, it cannot make sense of itself in language, right? And I think this becomes clearer when we think about, again, sense certainty of phenomenology, right? If you're just going around and pointing at things and say this, and that's the only operation you do with language, you're not pointing at anything determinate. You need to do more to be determinate, right? Because it's linguistically incomplete to just point, again, linguistically speaking, right? You need to be able to just say what you are pointing at. Otherwise, you're pointing at everything and nothing. So I think that's when I say pure immediacy is not determinate, that's what I mean, that it cannot be really translated into that language, which we already have said what the problems exist there. Houlgate, the thing that it's not happening. Houlgate is saying it's just like pure immediacy just like collapses because it's pure immediacy. And I'm baffled by that point. It just seems like that I have to just accept it as sure, pure immediacy is just nothing. But why? Like, I don't see any argument. If this is not a claim, if there's no claim here, what does it even mean to say that it doesn't make sense? It doesn't make sense as what, right? And things become harder, I think, for Houlgate to make sense of, because it's not that suddenly we realize, oh, pure wasn't, being wasn't pure, right? We realize that it is impure for whatever reason. No, nothing is also pure, and nothing is also immediate. So that part of the story doesn't change. We need another mover here, that I think is the concept of determinacy, like being determined, being able to determine, and that the determination, I think, has a presupposition attached to it, linguistic articulation.
Yes, thanks very much. I think that's I think I'm prompted by your sharing of the parallel between phenomenology of spirit and logic of being. And an anecdote from my undergraduates come to mind. There was a chemistry professor who managed to teach entire lectures exclusively with the two words, this and that, because he was really bad in English. But the problem here is there was a context for that index of reference. There was a PPT, there was all the symbols on background, so like we could like understand what he was talking about. But still, some people may deem that his pedagogy was invalid. And like we can appeal to like the dean of like a school of natural science, say this person is not qualified to teach at the university level, and they can send people to inspect and whatever. So I think this is the third point. If we come into the stage of some people saying pure immediacy is sufficient for me, this is the reality. I need nothing more than that. If like it itself doesn't have a claim that I must be determinate, and we don't have the assumption that being determinate must be articulated linguistically, let's just stay there. Like you need a certain, I don't know, delegate from the dean office to force me to realize actually I'm a bad teacher. But what would be like according to the slides, called a criterion of validity? How do we really adjudicate this whole process for moving forward or whatever purely immanently in Hegel's project? Yes.
Yeah. So in what you just using what you said, just and use that as a transition here, is like I think Hegel is right to say that the this that kind of approach requires a context, right? And unless that context is articulated, you cannot really say what you were saying, right? You cannot, it doesn't make sense in that sense. I think we could say the exact same to Hegel, that unless you put pure immediacy in the context of demand for determination as it understood in full, you know, linguistic articulation, then nothing moves. And this is not the point of, you know, like Kierkegaard kind of a vibe of you need to be, you know, you need to have a will. It's not about a will in general. It's about a demand. More specifically, it's not about human psychology yet. That could be another problem, right? Which I don't think is a main problem here. But it's a demand. You're demanding something, and it fails to meet that demand. That demand itself, where is the critical analysis of that demand?
Right.
Right. Um, that seems to be missing, without saying that that demand is valueless. I think that demand is very valuable, but it's not what it pretends to be.
Right.
Now, in the sense of the criterion of validity, we have one specific case that really stood out to us. And I think kind of like clarifies a lot of like issues on that demand. This is slightly different from what we have talked about so far. That's about becoming, right? No matter how you understand like being to nothing, what happens is that okay, your being ends up being nothing, and nothing ends up being being, and vice versa. And okay, that just Hegel's term for this vanishing into the other is becoming. Sure. Now we move from becoming to determinate being. There's that move. And here is what happens with that. Hegel says, and I think Houlgate, with absolute loyalty, represents this, that being vanishes into nothing, nothing vanishes into being, and vice versa. Okay. Now, our original point, or our original stance was being and nothing are absolutely different, right? We were looking for this kind of pure affirmative existence, for the lack of whatever. But we just like ended up having just nothing, and just dissipation, nothing kind of having like any sort of togetherness. And then we're just like, okay, but that itself is kind of determined. Then we got there, got back, got there, got back. But in any case, we thought that being and nothing are absolutely different. But hey, look at what we have seen. Being and nothing vanish into one another. If being and nothing vanish into one another, that means that after all, they're not absolutely different, right? And that's why Hegel says that they must be moments of the same thing, for the lack of better terms, called determinate being or Dasein, right? Now, how could we make this move, right? The move says that if two concepts, entities, whatever you want to call them, vanish into one another, that means there is no pure difference. There is no absolute difference between them. They cannot be purely other than each other, right? If there is a transition from one to the other, that means they're not pure in the sense that they're not absolutely different. Okay, sure. So we can think about this as a conditional, right? If concept entity one ends up being entity number two, concept entity number two, or ends up vanishing into concept entity number two, that means that there is no absolute difference between them, and therefore there is no purity in place for each isolated concept or entity. Why? Like, where did this come from? Where did the validity of this conditional come from? I'm not rejecting this conditional. That would be a different point. I just don't know how to react to someone. I say exactly this, which I think we're confident. That's what Hegel says, and that was what Houlgate says. And that's rare to say. But I think this is just one of those cases that I think we know what they're saying, right? And I don't necessarily personally have a problem with this move, right? But if someone shows up, I tell them this, I said, yeah, this is why we have Dasein, because being nothing or vanishing into another, that just means they're not absolutely different. And becoming was about these two things being absolutely different. They're not. And they say, no, that's not a valid inference. What is my response? Like, where did the validity of that logical inference come from? Is it like a meta level logic that says that like this inference is correct? How could I even adjudicate this? Right? If you are obsessed with immanence, it seems like that you cannot do what you are trying to do unless you have to create the logic of every inference that you are making at the same time that you're making the inference, right? And at the same time justify it. I don't see anything like that happening, right? And just think about that project. That sounds insane, because you want to make an inference, you want to also not just make an inference, but create a logical inference. And not only just create a logical inference that in these conditions we do that, but just say that that is absolutely justified on one move. That would be immanence. That would definitely be immanence. If you can make the inference, claim the logic of inference, and justify it at the same time, you have made an immanent move. If you are moving based on an assumption about what is a logical inference, then your logic is not coming. The transitions are not logically dependent on only the concepts that exist in the prior sections. It's coming from somewhere else, which could be a question. What is this someone else? Because Hegel is notorious for his problem with formal logic and law of non-contradiction and all of that. What is this? Is this part of formal logic? He could be critical of law of non-contradiction. He could be critical of whatever this inference is, which I don't see him being critical of that.
Right. Just seconding what yours have just told us. While I was listening to Houlgate's lecture recording, he had a very intriguing line saying that the conventional law of non-contradiction has no place in the project of science and logic until it's been proven to be the case. And if this from becoming to Dasein is a realization that two things, if they vanish into each other, they are not absolutely different, we can probably consider this as sort of Hegel's own version of law of contradiction. And when was it proven to be the case in the whole project then? So in what sense is he truly doing a purely immanent project with absolutely no external court of appeal, so to speak, whenever a dispute comes about? Yes.
That the use of the term court of appeals, I think, is very important, because one of the baffling experiences in dealing with Hegel's science of logic is that because it wants to be immanent, or it claims to be, then it just becomes very hard to say, okay, like I disagree.
Right.
Like, where should we go if we disagree? Like, how should we go about disagreement about like movement from becoming ending up being Dasein? Like, it doesn't seem to be that space seems to be, even if we say, right, that let's say this point we mentioned about absolute difference, like 300 pages on, right? We get to a transition, and that transition proves to us that that doesn't make any sense, right? You gotta update it, right? It's time for an update of that logical inference, right? Even if like this logic of inference is imminently improving in Hegel's science of logic, that is not enough, because what is the prior one? There is always this kind of a beginning. What is the court of appeal for very beginning? And that's not even like, notice that here our criticism is not about linguistic articulation. We accepted linguistic articulation, right? Even then, like even say that, oh, pure immediacy is not determinate, and therefore it is indeterminate. And okay, now that it is indeterminate, it is still determined as indeterminacy, right? Like even something like that, some points like that, someone could say today it's indeterminate. It's not determined as indeterminacy. It's indeterminate. Like, how could we? This is not a point that we are trying to make about like, look at this like flaw in this specific part of Hegel's science of logic. This is just like the absence of a court of appeals, which I think it becomes fascinating if you think about this in a more broad sense outside of Hegel. Like in general, what is the court of appeal in like establishing something is correct or not? Because this is not only Hegel's problem, but it just becomes clear while we look at this kind of claim of immanence. Do you have anything to add to that,
Very
Trent?
quickly, something. I just think
Mhm.
the legal language has a huge potential here, because when we think about that, is there are, given what we've talked about on the slide, the unknowledge, we consider the whole science of logic as an enterprise to build a state, whatever, or legal tradition. And there is certain, I don't know, at points it feels that way to me at least, unacknowledged or invisible constitution that guides everything, like his own version of say non-contradiction. And the way you said is very interesting, that even if it proved to be the case later on, it doesn't make the law retroactive. Like you cannot, how do we end up there if there were no such legal precedent at the very beginning? So I think that's an analogy we should perhaps bear in mind and think with while reading along the relationship between so-called enabling and grounding presuppositions and the internal coherence of Hegel's science of logic. But that's all I want to say.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a very good panel, and yeah, it is interesting that it is like the point is not about one specific part of the chain, but the chain itself, and it's yeah, it doesn't seem to be. I wonder in general, and of course I don't expect us to talk about that right now, but like I'm interested to see like if this is not like this is not a simple like, oh, okay, whatever, right? Because think about this. So if this is the case about Hegel's project, this is the same time the problem with anyone's project. Like
Right,
even the most skeptical person is
right,
also using some
right,
like chain of like, okay, given that like senses are so and so, then there's this other thing, right? And it just again we're back there. Even like trying to say that, oh, okay, let's go and see whether this logic works. We're already bringing something, and that seems to always evade. Even like examination of that requires a logic of examination. And I think Hegel has this criticism of this kind of epistemology first strategy that we get into probably in the next episode. This is not to say that, oh, now Hegel is wrong, Kant was right. Right? This is a much broader problem that just came to us as a result of dealing with Hegel. Now, let's talk about the last thing about immanence and presuppositionlessness here. And I think we can end this episode and then talk about the rest of our problems next time. This is your friend, Trent. The point about polarity and negation. So I would just very briefly say, like, in what context you're thinking about this kind of polarity in the case of polarity, and then you just take the stage. Okay, being collapses. Being being doesn't make sense, right? For whatever reason. And then we're in a space that is just polarized, both like evidently in language, but also as articulated in the logic, as just the opposite. And there are mediaries, but like this whole idea of the polar structure, we have reality from negation, right? This keeps happening. Why? Trent has more.
Well, I don't have like a solution, because I just find it interesting, and I have certain suspicion this might be a unintentional borrowing or infiltration from maybe natural language. I don't know. My question is, if being in thinking of itself as a pure immediacy, then realize that this is not self-sufficient, whatever, then it seems the case there is only one alternative to this, namely nothing. Why? It seems to me they are not being under nothing and later on reality and the negation. They are not necessarily, have been not been proven to me as being structural parallels, that they encompass different possibilities around or unstructuredness, but there's certain assumption, I think, that the way negation evolves follows this structure of being evolves. They are transparent and like translatable structural development between the two, and which I just find not necessarily the case if we can imagine, say, a natural language where, or not necessarily, perhaps even a logical language and not necessarily spoken by any community, that what we use in English language does not have one specific counterpart, but multiple, maybe. Who guarantees that the logical opposite of, say, a determined affirmation is one? It seems that's an umbrella term to hold all possible alternatives together and assuming it's logical equivalent to reality or being in that sense. Do you hear what I'm saying here? And
yes.
One more thing is, all the languages I know have that, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily the case. And I think there's such an assumption that such not as the equal counterpart to the affirmative, positive diction is universal in a sense. Whereas I do know certain languages that do not have tenses, even though the language users definitely have their temporal consciousness. They will use other things like aspects, like probabilities, to differentiate what really happened with certitude, or counterfactual, that is never happened, so it was also certain, but in the future it's like possible, likely, or probable, so it's different degree of a possibility. Use that to differentiate time. Could we perhaps envision a natural language with which people will consider, once the pure immediacy, whatever being vanishes, there's not one, but say multiple, say two. One is like neutral, or the third being like I'm thoroughly confused or self-defeating. So that's my question, and I do not know whether that is a assumption or part of his so-called grounding principle of like that external meta logic which guides the course of unfolding of this project, or it's something he would love to like demonstrate in the future, and even if it is a case, that would it be like retroactive? Yes.
I think this is excellent. And this reminded me
Right.
of a specific section on Beyond Good and Evil from Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil that I think it might be good if we put it out here. I want to read it, and then we can finish this episode. It's section 20 of Beyond Good and Evil, towards the end, and Nietzsche is talking about language. Nietzsche writes, "The strange family resemblance of all Indian, Greek, and German philosophizing is explained easily enough. Where there is affinity of languages, it cannot fail, owing to the common philosophy of grammar, I mean, owing to the unconscious domination and guidance by similar grammatical functions, that everything is prepared the outset for a similar development and a sequence of philosophical systems. Because as the way seems barred against certain other possibilities of world interpretation, it is highly probable that philosophers within the domain of the Ural Altaic languages, where the concept of the subject is least developed, look otherwise, quote unquote, into the world, and will be found on paths of thought different from those of the Indo-Germanic peoples and the Muslims. The spell of certain grammatical functions is ultimately also the spell of physiological valuations and racial conditions. So much by way of rejecting Locke's superficiality regarding the origin of ideas." I think we can finish this episode with that.
Okay. All right. So we should probably leave the listeners there with that quote, and come back to our critical remarks next time. So, dear listeners, stay attuned. Our further critical remarks are coming up.